Good afternoon and welcome to this joint seminar that's being hosted by Doughty Street Chambers and by Irwin Mitchell Solicitors. We're looking at the incredibly serious and emotive issue of the use of seclusion and restraint in schools. As a firm and also as a set of chambers, we've represented young people and parents coming to terms with incredibly difficult situations which have arisen in the school environment. Often there's been systematic restraint and seclusion of children, and none of that information shared at the time with parents. So we've collaborated so that this is an opportunity to discuss these really important issues that raise fundamental issues regarding civil liberties and young people's human rights. It's also very timely, as the Department for Education issued on the 16th of February a call for evidence, a long outstanding process to give stakeholders, young people, parents, everyone who's concerned about these issues an opportunity to respond to the consultation. We should be looking at a range of issues. Later on today, there'll be an opportunity in breakout groups to look at some of the questions and to start really thinking in a focused way to maximise this opportunity to respond to the consultation. We are more than mindful of the long-term adverse impact on young people who experience restraint and seclusion in schools. We also note the concerns of the teaching profession and parents to ensure a safe environment. So how do we balance these incredibly important issues? I don't want to spend very long taking up time with this introduction because there are others who have got far more experience of on the ground and coal face experience and issues to raise with us. I turn now to Becky Gillespie, pioneering, campaigning individual, so that you can also say a few words before I give an introduction for the first case study session. We focused the session around experts giving examples of good practice and talking about steps that we should be thinking about in terms of the longer term issues and responding to the consultation. So, Becky.
Hi, yeah, my name's Becky Gillespie. I'm one of the parents, or one of the families who Irwin Mitchell have helped to take legal action against a school group, and our daughter won a human rights case, won an out of court settlement in a human rights case because of the restraint that she was subjected to within a school setting. I don't want to say too much now. I'm also a member of ICARS, and we're going to present in a second a presentation that we've put together, which hopefully will help inform some of the discussion today.
So, in terms of an introduction before Becky talks about good practice, I'd just like to give an overview of ICARS. And in terms of their bio, they are a parent, survivor, and neurodivergent-led advocacy team working to put in place legislative protections for children to end institutional abuse, including the use of restraint and seclusion in school settings. With global advocacy partners, ICARS are currently working in the USA and England, also about to embark on a new initiative with partners in New Zealand and are partnered with advocates in Canada. ICARS team members have written and passed numerous state legislative bills across America and are currently part of the federal coalition supporting the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, headed by Paris Hilton, Rebecca Mellinger, Caroline Cole. Caroline Coles is an ICARS special advisor and international policy lead. In addition to this work, the ICARS team also supports and works with families directly affected by restrictive practices and institutional abuses. Before I pass to Becky, I would add that the session is being recorded today, so don't worry if you can't scribble away notes and record what's happening as we speak. You'll be able to access all of this information afterwards.
Okay. So for those of you who don't know, ICAR stands for the International Coalition Against Restraint and Seclusion, and I'm joined on Zoom by my colleague somewhere, Zoe, who's originally from London, but who now lives just outside Washington DC, which is where she's joining us from today. So before I start, I want to thank Doughty Street Chambers and Owen Mitchell for inviting us here to present alongside other advocates in this field. We know that there are a number of ICAR's partners and allies who've taken the time to join the seminar today, mostly on Zoom, although some of them have come today. And we want to thank you for coming, particularly those from the autistic community. We are abundantly aware that the autistic community is a targeted population subjected to restrictive practices in schools. Yet to date it is apparent that the autistic community have not been included or been given appropriate access to discussions or decision-making processes around the use of restraint and seclusion in schools in England. And it's our firm belief that moving forward, this desperately needs to change. We certainly look forward to hearing others' insights and engaging in discussion on this important topic today. But can I also say that very soon now, ICARS will be releasing the ICARS Report England, which I'll mention a few times in our presentation. We're sorry we haven't got it out for today, but it will be released soon. We've been supported by a raft of talented and inspirational individuals to produce our report, and we hope that on its release it will be disseminated widely and that it will be a useful document helping to inform this debate. Just check that is it working? Yes. Oh, no, I've gone. Sorry. Okay, so the Department for Education's consultation on the use of reasonable force and restrictive practices in schools states that Section 93 of the Education and Inspections Act of 2006 provides all school staff, including non-teaching staff, with the power to use reasonable force to prevent pupils from hurting themselves or others, from damaging property or causing disorder. When it is safe, lawful, and absolutely necessary, the government supports school staff to use reasonable force, including restraint, as an intervention. This presentation seeks to address what is safe, what the government need to amend in terms of what is considered lawful, and what is deemed absolutely necessary from an international best practice legislative perspective. It is informed by the lived experience of survivors of restrictive practice, families and children's lived experiences, specifically across England, as well as our own direct knowledge and experience in the legislation of protections for children with disabilities in order they be best protected. If efforts to abolish or eliminate the use of restraint in schools are to be successful, politicians will need to be informed of the international precedents which have been set in these areas. And so we will walk you through why we believe legislation is so important, and why we also intend to briefly examine 3 areas of international best practice pertaining to safety, what is lawful, and what is absolutely necessary. Of course, there are lots of areas that we could cover within our half hour. The use of restrictive practices in schools is an expansive topic, but I hope that you will find what it is we have chosen to share this afternoon in the short term we have useful, thought-provoking, and possibly provocative. Whilst we want to collaborate, we also make no apologies for wanting to change the status quo or for wanting to challenge people into action. Okay, so the first regulations protecting children in educational settings from the use of restraint and seclusion were enacted in the USA in 2001. For international clarity, regulation in the USA means a rule or order issued by a government agency and often has behind it the force of law. We don't have similar protections in England, and so this means that England is now over 2 decades behind the States and also New Zealand in addressing this issue and protecting children from restrictive practices in educational settings. It also means that what we do have is other countries' experiences to learn from. Do our children need further legislative protections? We believe so. When examining the Department for Education's most recent releases that relate to restrictive practices in schools, including the current consultation, England's present direction of travel appears to us to be relying almost entirely on the expectation that culture change within settings, perhaps prompted by new guidance, will change practice. Whilst culture change is essential, regrettably, what has been seen internationally is that promoting cultural change alone does not create widespread systemic change. Rather, for widespread systemic change to occur, legislation has been necessary to drive that change. As an example, Barnard Brack et al. In 2014 examined factors relating to the use of restraint in schools. Working in the USA, they had the advantage of being able to compare states with different laws. They found that the probability of restraint being used decreased by 59% in states with a policy governing the use of restraint, whereas in states who didn't have a policy governing the use of restraint, but who did, like England, have an anti-corporal punishment law, The likelihood of restraint only decreased by 35% when compared with those states with no regulation. And so they determined that regulations have a very clear effect on the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. One of the ongoing difficulties we have in England is that there has been no forensic analysis of the issue of restraint and seclusion in England's schools to inform law and policy makers what is safe, what should be deemed lawful, and what is absolutely necessary. Indeed, this is why ICARs have joined with families in calling for a public inquiry. In relatively recent times, there has been a Department for Education consultation in 2019, but this was never reported on. The EHRC Restraint in Schools inquiry of 2020-2021, using meaningful data to protect children's rights. This inquiry has led to some really useful recommendations around recording reporting, although the EHRC themselves were clear that their report was limited in scope. And of course, we have the new consultation released by the Department for Education in February this year, which we do have some concerns about in terms of its breadth. We worry that the consultation questions are limited in nature and don't cover the subject adequately enough to address many of the key factors that are instrumental to formulating effective law and policy. We particularly worry that it does not seem to take sufficient note of the dangers of restrictive practice and the long-term impact that restraint and seclusion is having on children and families. In contrast, internationally, other countries' audit of practice to inform policy have and continue to centre their analysis of the use of restraint and seclusion on the experiences of pupils and the abuses endured by them, in partnership with educators' viewpoints. These approaches remain centred on the protection of children and children's rights. To highlight the disparities between England's consultations and international forensic audits on the use of restrictive practices in schools, our next slide will show Greg Cutts, the Managing Director of Forensic Audits and Special Investigations for the US Government Accountability Office in 2010, testifying before the Committee on Education and Labour at the House of Representatives, what we would recognise in England as Capitol Hill in Washington, DC. Can I just say that this following testimony includes descriptions of restraint practices, child suicides, life-threatening restraint, child abuses and child death. We ask that those watching who could be triggered please mute their screens until this short video, which runs for just less than 3 minutes, has concluded. I'll pause for a few moments when the video has finished in order to allow participants who have muted to rejoin the presentation.
Discuss seclusion and restraint of children. There are allegations of the abusive use of seclusion and restraint in public and private schools. My testimony today addresses these allegations. My testimony has two parts. First, I will provide you with a brief background, and second, I will discuss the results of our investigation. First, there are no federal laws restricting the use of seclusion and restraint in public and private schools. At the state level, laws and regulations vary widely. For example, 19 states have no laws or regulations that restrict the use of seclusion and restraint. At the other end of the spectrum, 8 states specifically prohibit the use of restraint that restricts breathing. Although no national data is available, for California and Texas alone, it was reported that there were 33,000 instances of seclusion, restraint, or other interventions during the 2008 school year. Moving on to the results of our investigation, we identified hundreds of allegations of the abusive use of seclusion and restraint in public and private schools. At least 20 of these cases resulted in death. Most of the allegations related to children with disabilities. Some of the more troubling allegations that we identified include a 3-year-old boy being strapped to a chair and secluded in a timeout room, a 5-year-old boy having his elbow fractured from a basket hold restraint, a teenage boy repeatedly being locked in a 4x6 timeout room and then being forced to stay there after defecating, a 13-year-old boy hanging himself in a seclusion room with a cord that teachers provided to him to hold up his pants, and a 17-year-old girl choking to death in her own vomit after being held in a face-down restraint. We took an in-depth look at 10 of these cases involving 18 children between the ages of 4 and 15. The purpose of our work was to validate the facts and circumstances for each of these cases. This included interviewing numerous people, along with reviewing police reports, autopsies, court records, and other evidence. The facts and circumstances we found for these cases were similar to those for the hundreds of allegations. Discuss seclusion and restraint of children. There are allegations.
Okay. So we'll just allow people to rejoin us if they've muted. It should be noted that that testimony is over a decade old, and that since then, 46 states in the US have enacted laws regarding the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. In addition, federal guidance was released in 2012, and the Keeping All Students Safe Act is presently in committee on Capitol Hill. Disturbingly, the abuses we've just heard spoken about by Greg Cutts to politicians in America mirror hundreds of such stories and allegations from parents across England who've submitted their lived experience testimonies for the upcoming ICAR's report. We should all be asking, why is nobody in England tasked with investigating these same abuses reported by families here as those being investigated to inform policy in America? Why are the lived experience testimonies of survivors and families whose children have been subjected to restraint and seclusion in educational settings in England not central to the process when policy and legislative change is being considered? This is seen as a necessary requirement by those already working and allied with ICARs on this issue across England. We need to take Arnie Duncan's words of 2012 seriously. There is no evidence that using restraint or seclusion is effective in reducing the occurrence of the problem behaviours that frequently precipitate the use of such techniques. Another warning, this next slide could be triggering. It details children's experience of restraint and seclusion within England, written in parents' and carers' own words. There are many, many examples we could give you from the 560 case studies we received from across England, but given time constraints, we're just providing these few. They were told that they couldn't educate him if not strapped in a chair. My son had previously broken his hand when a teacher slammed a door shut on him, and then they used a handheld restraint on him. Bruising, trauma, including attempts at suicide, immediately followed the use of restraint. It is almost 2 years since the Equality and Human Rights Commission released their inquiry report, Restraint in Schools, using meaningful data to protect children's rights. It is clear that since its release, no significant progress has been made by the Department for Education to progress the recommendations the HRC made. Yet recording and reporting and monitoring of data is without doubt a critical tool in eliminating the use of restraint and seclusion in educational settings. Quite simply, if we don't know what's happening in schools and educational settings, we don't know the extent of the issue or what the issues are. However, it must be noted that in and of itself, recording and reporting will not eliminate restrictive practice. This may seem to those of you here today to be a fairly obvious point, but we feel we need to say it because presently it appears that this is the primary, if not the only area in which the Department for Education are actually suggesting legislative change at the moment. The suggestion being that they enact Section 93A of the Education Inspections Act 2006. We suggest that far more is needed in order for children's rights to be upheld and England to be in line with best practice internationally. Recording and reporting alone does not address what is safe, lawful, or absolutely necessary. There are additional areas which need to be clarified by the Department for Education in regard to recording and reporting requirements of schools and also the notification of parents and carers. For example, we believe there needs to be a Department for Education recording and reporting policy initiative. There needs to be oversight bodies, committees, forensic audits on collected data. At the moment, there is no clarity around how the Department for Education intend data to be used or how it will change practice. There needs to be local authority and school compliance mechanisms. What happens to schools and local authorities who don't comply? There should be ongoing data quality reviews. How will the quality of the data being collected be reviewed? This isn't clear. And there should be technical assistance provisions and standardised reporting software such as CPOMs or similar for national implementation within educational settings to ensure standardised reporting. International best practice for the release of restraint and seclusion data can be seen in the States. Aggregated data encompassing 19 datasets is publicly available and reported on to politicians in Congressional Committee by the Government Accountability Office. We should be requiring the same level of transparency to parents, carers and the general public, along with annual reporting to government officials to inform ongoing policy and directives to eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion across England's educational settings. More in-depth data is collected at a state level across America and is used to inform these federal releases. In this slide, as an example, we show data released by Wisconsin. We've chosen Wisconsin because it is a state referenced by the HRC in its inquiry. The data collected includes the school district, school name, school type, the number of restraints, as well as the number of subjects subjected to that restraint per location. This is the type of data which England needs to release publicly. 1, to be in line with international best practice, and 2, to ensure that the rights of children, particularly children with disabilities who are disproportionately affected by restrictive practices, are upheld. Another area relating to recording and reporting that we have concerns about is the notification of parents. Presently, whilst it's deemed good practice, there is no compulsion for schools to inform parents when a child has been restrained. It seems to be a generally held viewpoint, with little evidence to substantiate it, that schools are communicating with parents as per good practice guidelines. Yet our research has uncovered many cases where parents simply haven't been told. In fact, of the 560 cases from across England in the ICARS report, only 28% of respondents had been consistently told each time their child had been subjected to restrictive practices. In order to be in line with international best practice, we believe there needs to be a Department for Education parental care and notification policy. There needs to be standardised verbal and written documentation procedures across all schools in England to avoid reporting variations across the 9 educational regions. And we would expect that standardised notification to cover approximately 23 areas of recording and notification to parents. This is a huge area. There's so much more we could talk about, but we do need to move on. So we now move on to examine other legislative measures used internationally working towards the elimination of the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. For the purposes of today's seminar, we'll look briefly at 2 areas where there is international precedent set that we believe is extremely pertinent to children across England. At present, both New Zealand and states within the USA have legislative measures in place which prohibit the use of restraint and seclusion for anything other than last resort, where it is used as emergency practice to prevent imminent serious injury or death. The Federal Resource Document 15 Principles, a summary of policy recommendations from 2 longer and more detailed documents available for the Council for Children with Behavioural Disorders regarding the use of physical restraint and seclusion procedures in schools, states they should not be implemented except as a last resort when a child or others are in immediate danger. It also states that restraint or seclusion should never be used as punishment or discipline, e.g. placing in seclusion for out-of-seat behaviour, as a means of coercion or retaliation or as a convenience. Similar language can be found in the 15 principles released in Australia by the Victorian government. Whilst England's present lack of recording and reporting aggregated data does not allow us to definitively state that restraint is being disproportionately used on disabled children, within the ICARS report, we evidence that of the 560 families who responded, only 3% of the children whose stories were shared had no diagnosis or suspected diagnosis at the time of their submission. These findings are consistent with the data collected in America, where restrictive practice data is rigorously collated. In America, it has been seen that children with disabilities and Black, Indigenous, people of colour are disproportionately affected by the use of restrictive practices in schools. Yet England continues to allow restraint for the purpose of good order and discipline. This is not last resort. In order for children with disabilities to be protected from the reckless use of restrictive practices which ignore situations arising from manifestation of disability, which are too often incorrectly perceived as behavioural challenges by educators, we need new legally binding rules which do not allow restrictive practice to be used for behavioural episodes, discipline, or damage to property. Again, England is extremely behind in this area. International politicians have prohibited restrictive practices for the purpose of purposes of punishment or discipline, a means of coercion or retaliation, a convenience, or to prevent property damage. It is clear that restrictive practice use in education needs to fall in line with other settings, making it a practice of last resort with a clear definition of what last resort means, instead of being an instrument of reasonable force as described by the Department for Education guidance. The term reasonable force doesn't have a legal definition, and so in essence is a buzz phrase, which in itself we consider to be deceptive when considering the last area we want to address today. There is lots of discussion in England presently around Article 3, Article 5 and Article 8 rights when considering the use of restraint in schools, and we completely agree. But ICARs also think that Article 2, the right to life, needs to be brought into the conversation, particularly as the Department for Education themselves cite that they support the use of force when it is safe. We personally know families who have lost children killed by teachers using restraint in school settings. Therefore, we do not gloss over this subject as easily as others may. Personally, I can vividly remember learning of Max Benson's death in 2018, little knowing that I'd later meet his mother. But just a few short months after we'd become aware that my daughter was being restrained on an almost daily basis to the ground by multiple members of staff, supine and T-wraps or basket holds used regularly, dangerous holds. Like many parents in our position, all I could think was, it could have ended differently. If efforts are successful in gaining legislative change, everyone knows there will be extremely rare times when restraint may have to be legitimately used to prevent a death or serious physical harm. We would all want a teacher to prevent a road accident or a dangerous fall. However, we cannot imagine that anyone here would think that the use of restraints which have killed children should continue to be used on children. Yet this subject is not being addressed with the gravitas we believe it deserves. We say this not from our work and experience in America, but more importantly today, we say it because of the experiences we know of children here in England that have and who continue to run the very real risk of death at the hands of an educator. There seems to be a misconception that children in America are more at risk from dying in a hold than children in England, that perhaps the restraints used are different. What we actually need to acknowledge is that prone, supine, basket holds, neck holds, and restraints that inhibit oxygen and blood flow are the same procedures using the same techniques globally. They don't change according to where they are performed. We're going to share with you some quotes from parents and carers across England. These are their words, they haven't been edited. Again, if you think you may be triggered, we ask you mute your speakers and turn away as we present the testimonies of parents and carers of children who couldn't breathe. Child was restrained and locked in a cupboard, sat on by a grown person, pulled across the floor by arms. His arms were crossed on his chest and pulled back behind his back. He was choking and unable to breathe. At his special school, he had been restrained regularly but was injured in 2021 from a caring sea hold. His mouth bled and he collapsed after because he couldn't breathe. Described how the staff restrained him during a video interview with police. It accurately describes a face-down basket hold. He also told social workers they would strangle him and he could not breathe. When he demonstrated to police, it was a basket hold. At the high school, it was always a first resort, held for long periods of time. I know my son thought he would die on at least one occasion. He couldn't breathe and they had to help him. I never knew this until much later. He suffered prone restraint after a seated hold was done badly. Parents were not told. We saw bruises and he was short of breath hours after, and ribs were subluxed. Red markings in the wrists, arms, bruising, a hole in the inside of his cheek, and he collapsed, complaining he couldn't breathe and felt dizzy and sick. No medical attention was given. So life-threatening restraint is legislated against across states in America and Australia and across all of New Zealand. We need to follow suit in order to be in line with best practice and to uphold England's children's rights in the same measure as children internationally. Moved on. Some examples of the legislative language and practices which are prohibited include the following, taken directly from past legislative texts in New Zealand and America. Physical restraint, so these are things that have been banned, been prohibited. Physical restraint that inhibits the student's breathing. physical restraint that inhibits the pupil's communication, such as speaking or augmentative communication, sign language, etc. Prone restraints, face down, physical restraint. Pressure points and pain holds, headlocks, tackling, sitting, lying or kneeling on a student. Place a student in a face down position. Place a student in any other position that would obstruct a student's airway or otherwise impair a student's ability to breathe. Straddle a student's torso. Use of prone restraints, i.e. lying face down, or any other restraints that restricts a student's breathing or harms the student. Covering a student's mouth or nose in any way that interferes with breathing. Has that moved on? Yes. Taking a student to the ground into the prone or supine position. Putting stress on a student's joints, applying pressure to the neck, back, chest or joints, deliberately applying pain to gain compliance, intentionally causing a student to fall. Having a person sitting, lying or kneeling on a student. Headlocks, choke holds, basket holds, bear hugs, therapeutic holding or wrestling holds, including full or half Nelsons. Using a hog tie position. Straddling any part of a student's body. Dragging a student along the ground. And just need to say that none of these practices are actually prohibited in England's schools. We want to end our presentation this afternoon with the words of those working in education, those who understand the issues we've sought to address today. A teacher from England told us, "It wasn't until I moved schools that I realised that things could be done differently. Both schools were good schools and the staff were caring in both schools. They wanted the best for the children. But in my new school, things were different because they didn't use restraint." In the States, teaching unions are now backing the calls for legislation to protect children from abusive restraint practices. Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, said in 2022, "Physical restraint should be used only when there is imminent danger of injury and only when imposed by trained staff. Secluding students should never be allowed, nor should mechanical restraints." We're really hopeful that England's teaching unions will come on board and ask for decisive action in the form of legislation like they have in America. The stories of increased violence against staff in special schools that came out of the NASUWT conference just this weekend surely shows that we need to stop trying to use a sticking plaster to address these issues. We need co-production and decisive action to be taken for both the sake of children and educators. Finally, we want to show you a short clip from a head teacher in America, taken in 2012, over a decade ago. He eliminated restraint and seclusion from his school, and we want you to take particular note of his final point.
When I first arrived here, it was the most violent school I'd ever been in my life. There was so much noise, slamming of doors, teachers raising their voices, students screaming, pounding on timeout room walls. The year before I came to this school, there were 1,064 physical restraints. These were loud and messy and violent affairs, sometimes involving up to 3 adults, basket holds on the floor. I came in with the idea that these children could learn, that they could make good choices, that they could be held accountable for their behaviors if we, the adults, would take the time to teach them. And we're going to know that we're successful when we eventually eliminate the use of physical restraint and seclusion timeout from this setting.
And have you done that?
We have done that. In fact, we did that within 6 months.
What's wrong with physically restraining a student who's acting up and might get violent?
It's a very dangerous activity, first of all. In my experience, it actually causes the child to act more aggressive. They become more violent under those conditions. It disrupts the entire learning environment. Restraint doesn't teach you anything. It punishes you, but it doesn't tell you what to do instead.
So you don't think these restraints, these seclusion rooms, you don't think they work?
I do not. I think they contribute to the problem.
How so?
They make children angrier. They make children resentful. They make children want to engage in more aggression, to get even, to get back.
You're convinced then it's not necessary except in the most dire circumstances.
I am. It contributes to the problems these children have rather than resolves them.
And what about these seclusion rooms,
Yes,
padded
Yes.
cells?
Yes.
What do you make of those?
they are cells. I've seen children behave so horribly in those rooms. I don't even know. I've seen them strip and urinate. I've seen them spread feces. I've seen one time a boy took his shoe off and was beating himself in the face till there was blood all over the place.
So you think these rooms are counterproductive, cruel?
These rooms should be prohibited. They should be prohibited.
Why?
They are cruel. I believe they bring out the worst in these students. And when they bring out the worst in these students, then it's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Look how wild they are. Of course we have to restrain them. And it justifies the continued use of these archaic techniques.
And do you feel the same thing about physical restraint?
I do.
It should be prohibited?
That's a tougher question. Behavior happens in a context. Someone else is helping them go up that escalation ladder to the point where you can't turn it around. And then you have a big problem. I support the legislation that would put conditions around physical restraint so that it really is reserved for those times when it is an imminent threat.
What happens in schools that use these restraints and seclusion rooms? What's the result? What's the message the students get from that?
The message they receive, they can't control their behavior. I think they feel outraged. I think they feel violated. I think they feel angry and resentful.
Does it seem barbaric to you?
It does. It truly does.
You've seen or heard of the stories of some of these restraint cases
I have.
where students have died.
I can't believe that anything we're doing in schools is important enough to take a person's life. When I first arrived,
Okay, so this is an expansive subject, and we've just given you an overview, but we think that it's clear that in order to ensure that restraint and seclusion are genuinely used across England as an emergency practice of true last resort, that governmental guidance, even statutory guidance, is not going to be sufficient. Rather, in order to prevent lifelong harm and the risk of death, and indeed in order to uphold children's human rights, restrictive practice use in school needs to be legislated about in its own right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that very, very powerful presentation. Some of the key issues I've taken from your presentation is the inadequacy of legislative provision, some horrendous examples of practices used in schools, and a very strong argument that there should be clear prohibition in terms of some of those practices. A call to have more parity in terms of legislative and guidance provision in the UK, and looking at best practice abroad and those jurisdictions that have taken a much more robust approach in terms of legislation. And very rightly identifying Article 2 and the risk to life in these really, really serious circumstances. Some triggering information there and images and stories. So I hope that those of you tuning in remotely were able to take a break if you needed to. We have quite a tight schedule and there may well be some questions that individuals want to ask. We've just invited you to ask questions and I now realise that we're probably running a bit tight. Are you happy to take at least one question, or would you prefer us to leave it till the end?
Maybe leave it to the
afternoon?
end. I think
Leave it to the end of the afternoon, because I think it's
having run
you're
off the train.
enormous as it is. Thank you. So there'll be some opportunity for questions in the last 20 minutes or so. What I'm going to do now is to introduce our next speaker, Gareth Morwood, who will be contributing remotely. So Gareth is an educational advisor for Studio 3. Previously, he worked for 25 years in UK schools, 17 of which he worked as a special needs coordinator in a large inclusive secondary school in the northwest of England. Gareth has extensive frontline experience supporting schools, families, and working directly with young people in the UK and abroad, particularly Chile, Dubai, Portugal, Ireland, and Scandinavia. So a very, very extensive experience. Gareth is a coordinator, co-director of the LASER programme, which fuses his critically acclaimed saturation model with low arousal approaches as part of a system-led model of inclusive practice. I'm pleased to see that the IT is working very smoothly this afternoon. It did cause me some anxiety, but it's going very well because I see that Gareth has joined us. So I'll now hand over to you, Gareth. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And hopefully people can see and hear okay. If there's a problem, could somebody give me a shout so that I can try and see what I can do to sort things out. What I wanted to try and do today was to draw on some of my personal experiences, having worked, as I say, in schools, leading a team of people myself, but also some of those experiences in working with other settings. And I think I probably come from this very strongly the view. I don't claim to have any great expertise or anything, but I have some experience that I hope to share. And I hope that the experiences that I can share today will be useful or of interest at least. I'm going to try and make sure you can get all these slides and everything, because there's quite a few links in them, and I've probably been a little ambitious as to what I intend to try and do. So hopefully we'll be okay. So I thought, when I was thinking about this, really to think about my journey and the fact that obviously leading a team of people in a big inclusive secondary school, what key things come up and what things come up in my conversations with parents and carers, young people and professionals in my current role. And I think something that always I come back to is this idea that actually restraint isn't just always physical restraint. There are many other things that I think need to be addressed and to be considered, particularly environmental restraints in schools, where we deny people coping responses when things become too stressful for them, for example. And I think, again, understanding this wider sense is something that's really important when we talk to professionals in settings. Particularly because a colleague of mine, Lorraine Peterson, often once said, you don't know what you don't know. And actually some people, as was illustrated in one of the examples in the first session, don't always know there's a different way if they're only used to one way. So I think it's really important we share these ideas and possibilities and stories that young people have. And I think, again, I would agree wholeheartedly with the head teacher at the end of that first session. Actually, if we understand the systems and the structures and the stresses we put on young people in schools, actually, we don't need to be using these approaches at all. And I think it comes back to the fact of well-trodden ground in the fact that there's some very, very poor gathering of data and understanding of the current situation, as was highlighted by Becky to start with. So I want to try, as we go through this short session, to talk about some of the discussions and some of the things I have with people, particularly about keeping the young person central to this and their voice as a core part of any work that's undertaken. And I think this is so important in things we talk about. And I think when we highlight some of the examples that have happened in English schools, I think staff in schools seeing things like Ellie Chappell's TEDx talk and listening to specific stories is really important for people to understand as part of that process of change. And I always think back to when I did my sort of master's degree in the late 90s, looking at systems and how we create systemic change for inclusion in the widest sense. And I think this is so important still now, that we value people. We identify with people the barriers that are happening and jointly work on finding solutions. And that to me is proper co-production, not assuming what challenges are or imposing things on people, but actually really working together and collaborating to find these solutions. And I think this is really, really important in everything that I'm going to try and just summarize in this short session today. And when I think about some of the things that actually cause young people to be distressed in schools, actually, a short list here, but actually everything that we can see there, really, I think a suitably qualified professional could do something about. So the way I think about it and talk to young people in the setting I was in for a long time was actually really engaging young people on the external factors, the environmental factors, the systems, the structures, etc., that are causing stress to an individual, and jointly trying to work how we reduce some of those stresses for that young person as part of a planned response. And I think that's really, really important to understand, because the less reactive we are, the more proactive we can become. And the key to this really for me is having systems and structures in place that allow us to do this. So a very simple thing that I would always advise schools to do is to get rid of line management processes, which are often about compliance and working through things, and build in coaching and supervision that are about people, that are about the systems, and allow that opportunity for reflective practice to be part of those teams' work. And I think that's really, really important. So there are some simple things that I have found over the years that I've been working with young people, with families and with settings that can make a difference just by how we approach things in essence. And I think, again, schools can be very, very challenging because of all these unwritten rules and these assumptions that people make. If a young person leaves slightly early to go to lunch in a big secondary school and they queue through the queuing system to go to the lunch, and usually that works all right. But one time the supply teacher beforehand lets them go late, and so it's quite close to the time 1,300 other children are going to leave for lunch. And the member of staff there says, "Oh, you haven't got time to queue now, just come right to the front, hurry up." And they're shouting, they're using just verbal instructions, they're not giving time for young people to process, and they're changing the systems, and it becomes too much for that individual. So that individual then is unable to cope. And actually, often these systems and the structures that are built into schools, when we work on coaching and understand how we're going about things, we can change those and reduce those risks about how we approach the work we do and the systems and the structures. And the other thing I think is really, really important, I try and encourage schools not to use the term behaviour, mainly because of all the assumptions that people have about the word, and often they're trying to benchmark that against what they think is their own experience or what should be normal per se. But to talk much more about stress and coping and how we, as we said before, can reduce the stresses young people experience while supporting coping strategies. So a very simple thing we did was to create a sort of one-page profile that we called a stress support plan. And this was part of documenting a collaborative discussion with the young person, the family, and the systems that we had in school, so that we had a very, very simple one-page document that explained some of the key things that we were working on in reducing those stresses while supporting the systems and the young people as well. Okay, there's a couple of images I'm going to show you now that some people may wish to just look away for 2 or 3 minutes or to mute the conversation because that they could be a little bit upsetting. But when we first started looking at our systems in school, we drew on some of the work that had been done by a colleague of ours, Professor Neil Humphrey at the University of Manchester. And these were images drawn by autistic young people who were in primary settings. And this young person has drawn themselves crying and people pointing and laughing at them. Again, this next image and what I'm going to read out could be upsetting. So I do want to give you a warning about that. This young person has drawn a picture of them and annotated to say that they were killed by a bomb and angels were sad to get him, but the pupils have a party because he's dead. These are the experiences of autistic young people in schools. And these young people were often people that the school setting said Oh, they're fine in school. I don't know what you're on about. They're always happy and smiling. They're always doing all right in school. And I think it's really, really important. One of the experiences from my staff team, but also from the work I've done with other settings, is to understand this notion of masking. And I think there's a fantastic paper by Kieran Rose and Amy Pearson that is really important for schools to read, to understand the concept, but also then to build in systems to get the voice of young people in a way that reduces the threat associated with just saying what you think people want to hear, so that they can get on to the next thing or comply with these systems, etc. And I'll explain to you a way that we work on trying to create systems to get the voice of young people in a habitual way that reduces that threat. And the other thing I think is really important for schools to understand are issues to do with creating a better understanding about what it means for individuals. And I think things like Damien's double empathy problem is a useful discussion point for school teams, particularly when we look at the quality of teacher training, the quality of professional development with regard to the wider inclusive agenda being very varied. So again, how we support this in schools, I think, is really important. So those are two things I think are important to understand. So in essence, the way I would look at it is always the idea that there are lots of stresses in life and in school settings. We can do a lot to reduce those stresses, whilst also trying to redress that balance by providing additional coping responses and opportunities for young people as part of a stress support plan. And it is entirely possible, in my opinion, to eliminate restraint and seclusion as part of this approach when we have the whole school approach and understand that as we go forward. So in essence, for me, it's like looking at a sort of a seesaw. Yeah, when we've got more challenges than resources, the stresses outweigh the ability to cope. It is entirely within our gift to redress that by reducing the stresses collaboratively and by working on systems that allow the policy, if you like, to be a cohesive view of what we're trying to achieve with young people at the centre of it. In essence, you know, nobody fights when they're relaxed and easygoing. So the more we can create inclusive environments that allow consistent, calm routines that actually are part of a joint approach, collaboration, it's entirely possible to improve outcomes for the learners that we're talking about. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go forward. So,
okay.
Oh, hello, somebody else I can hear, I think. I don't know. Okay. If that's okay. So I think, again, a big problem in some settings is that people are always reacting to crises. And actually, this quote from David Petoniak, I think, sums this up for people quite neatly. You know, trying to change things at a point of crisis or where somebody cannot cope is absolutely the worst time to do that. We need to plan and we need to collaborate when we're calm and when we're working with people. And then I think that's really, really important to understand. And I think a lot of time school systems that are very reactionary actually start creating more stress for the individuals involved. And I wrote about this a long time ago, really, what I call corporate responsibility, a chapter in this book. Where we want systems in schools that allow people to maintain them. Okay, so if a school has a 137-page behavior policy, I'm fairly certain nobody is going to be able to follow that and do anything with it. If we have a very clear statement that's a relationship policy that talks about the systems and about how we're creating that culture to maintain calm, consistent ways of working, there's a good chance that people will implement that change. And I think that's really, really important to understand. And the way we did that was developing what we call the saturation model. So we published this in 2011 after 4 years of development and funding from the European Social Research Council. And in essence, this was a model for working with autistic learners who had either been excluded from other settings or were not attending settings for whatever reason. And the reality of some of these learners was that some people had been excluded from very, very expensive private specialist settings and came to us, and this is how we developed our sort of way of working in essence. And I'd just say that every single learner that we worked with, and it's probably about 15 years that we were working with this way of working, every single learner went on to education, employment or training. So what in England is called the NEETs figure, not in education, employment or training, for us was 0. So we provided a pathway post-school for every learner we worked with, some of whom had had some very, very distressing experiences of education. And just to finally sort of say that I've used this as a school improvement tool with many different settings, not just for working with autistic learners. I think it's really important to understand a good understanding of how we redress the systems and the structures to do with stress and coping, help everybody, not just specific groups or young people with certain diagnoses, for example. And I haven't got time really to go into great detail about this today, but the key things for me are keeping the young person really central to decision making, understanding that environmental factors aren't just physical environmental factors, the emotional environment, the social environment, and as we said before, the communication environment are all things that we can actively do things to improve and change. And it's also really important that policy supports the practice, okay? So it's no good having a great provision in one setting if we have that fragmentation because a young person is really worried about what's going to be happening at lunchtime, for example. And, it's entirely possible to improve outcomes. This young lady, Lisa, as part of a bit of research we did a few years ago, I think summed things up really neatly. I get to do everything my friends do. It's just sometimes I have things changed a bit so I can join in properly. And why shouldn't she be able to join in properly? I think it's really important, as we said before, that we're in that solution-focused mindset as we go forward. So I've put in those links there. You can find out that quite easily just by Googling the saturation model. But again, I don't think it's groundbreaking stuff. I think it's just a way of drawing together some of the elements that we thought were really important into one place in essence. And also when I was thinking about back to where my journey sort of began, it was really thinking about things that sort of Rita and Damien have talked about a lot. Schools where difference is valued, there's less emphasis on conformity, but a greater focus on harnessing strengths to allow everybody to be the best they can become. And really everything I talk about and everything we've done over the years is very much about not parking a problem within a young person or trying to say that young person has to be resilient. We want to try and look at the environment and the people in it and build resilience into that so young people can be the best people they can be. And that's about personalization, not normalization, as Damien says. And in my experience, you cannot offer personalization unless you have clear, consistent ways of working that can be maintained. So I think it's really important that. So how we applied this really, we looked at different elements: saturation model, low arousal approach, positive psychology, as I said, looking at stress and coping, really understanding what co-production is, and that's jointly identifying challenges and jointly working on solutions. And I think it's really, really important. And I think that's so important for pre-verbal learners as well, and learners that communicate in different ways. I think we need to find ways that help young people really be part of their sort of processes and the ways of working. And reflective practice is really important in that. As I say, how we build in the systems into school structures and settings so that we allow reflective practice to be a core element of what we're doing. And a very simple thing for me, what we would term sort of planned escape. And there's some old videos there of me talking to a young lady, probably about a decade ago in school, where I'll be honest, I don't think we really knew what we were doing. We were just having a conversation and find solutions. But in essence, if the stress got too much for an individual, sometimes escaping that situation is the only way that that young person can cope. And that's human responses. That's your sort of survival mechanism kicking in, if that makes sense. So what we don't want is environmental restraints. For example, that person needing to escape and hitting a locked door, or a door with a very high handle that they can't reach. We want to build into the stress support plan that sometimes this young person may need to leave when they cannot cope. and place them in a position so they can calmly leave that situation. And then nobody needs to do anything else apart from know that that's part of the plan and build it into what we're doing. Virtually every school that in England particularly has sort of very secure perimeter fencing. So part of a planned response that's part of the stress support plan should mean we don't deny somebody that coping mechanism when they need it. And in essence, you wouldn't say to somebody, you've got to manage without your wheelchair today, or no, I'm not letting you wear your hearing aid today. So why do we deny people their coping response when they need it? So let's build in safe ways of supporting that need as part of a planned way of working. And the other thing I think was so core to everything we do was really engaging positively with parents and carers. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a book I've co-authored with a parent of autistic twins who I worked with at school. But this probably was the way that we really sort of galvanized our thoughts. There's a parental confidence measure I developed with Professor Caroline Bond, and we published in 2012. And actually everything here, I think, again, is common sense and obvious. But actually, every meeting we revisited all these things, and we tried really hard to think again how we can engage positively with parents and carers. And that includes, not just providing communication in written format, sometimes recording that so people can listen to the communications from school, building in lots of positives, use of text facilities to provide positive messaging for families, particularly when the history of their experience in other settings had been very much just focused on negative reporting and responses for the like. It's entirely within our gift to change that. And I think, again, this is a real core focus of a lot of the stuff that we did. And in essence, we drew these ideas together to create what we called the sort of laser program. And this is very much about building resilience into the place and the people, not parking the resilience within the child. And I think that's so important. And the important thing about this is that we have a clear way of working that looks at reducing stress whilst creating the culture and ethos of low arousal. And what's really important for me is that each setting often needs a bespoke approach. So you don't sort of do this, tick it off and get a certificate and then crack on. What we do is we work with people and create bespoke ways of working around those individual solutions. And the idea is that we can provide support for individuals who receive education anywhere. An individual who might receive education at the home, a small group of people that receive education in a very specialist setting, right through to international mainstream schools. And we articulated this in a book chapter we published a couple of years ago. So I put the link there if you're interested in just exploring some of that a little further when you get the slides as we go forward. And this is Bobby. I say Bobby's mum, Debbie, and I have worked together and collaborated on a book I'll share the link with. But this is a long time ago. Bobby's 19 now. And he talks about schools really good because they have many autistic students and understand us. And I think, being able to, at the age of 11, come into a big secondary school and understand that you are not alone and you have that sense of belonging, I think is really, really important in what we did. And I think, again, social time's great. I get to hang out with other students who share interests like myself. And I think, again, finding that sort of common ground and sense of belonging was so important to what we did. And just a quick shout out for an organization called Mind of My Own that you may or may not heard of, who produce various apps and support things with technology that allow us to build in systems to get the voice of young people as part of the routine and regular ways of working. So rather than somebody being called to give their views for a review meeting or something, when actually it can be very intimidating, having to go to the office, fill in a form, etc., having a very simple app that twice a week, the young person at home with a parent or carer can just type in to say how they're feeling, what things are going like, give their voices on and the views on certain things, creates a habitual way of getting those young people's voices as part of the routines of working, rather than it being a sort of a forced situation at one point in time. There's a little code there, GDM15, that you can use for those two books from the Studio 3 shop if you're interested in that. And just to finish off, I just sort of mentioned the book that I co-authored with Debbie, who is parent of autistic twins. Debbie also ran a magazine called Orchids, and you can find all 50 copies of that free online, aukids.co.uk. And we, in that, draw on our experiences of working with lots of different families and lots of different school settings to talk about the journey and some of the things we did. And I think probably the thing that's most off-putting with that is the fact that it says secondary school, where actually there's a load in that for wherever you receive education, in essence. And just to finish off, something that I feel passionately about really is that, you know, not a single child, in my view, is born disabled, homophobic, racist, or whatever. You know, external factors create opportunities for people to go down different paths, etc. And being restrained regularly is absolutely one of those things. And I think it's entirely within our gift to do things, some of which I've just touched on today, that mean we can eliminate that. So it's entirely possible to actually work with young people who are experiencing significant distress in various settings, and improve those outcomes and give those people great life chances. And I think hopefully that gives you a little taster of some things. I know it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but my contact details and everything are there if you wish to know anything else or something I touched on. And hopefully that's okay for now. Is that all right, everybody?
Thank you. That's really, really excellent. Thank you very much, Gareth, for giving such constructive, positive overview and advice on techniques. What I took from that was the importance of keeping young people central to decision making, identifying barriers, working jointly to reduce stress in the school environment, having planned responses, and ensuring that we look at the situation in a way which is broader than just looking at environmental factors. Bespoke provision as well for different settings. So I found that incredibly helpful, and I hope that the resources that you shared with us and are available after today can be considered by those of you who are here in person and who are joining us remotely in terms of looking at alternatives and perhaps also helping in terms of your responses to the consultation and further afield. We're running very well to time, so we're due a coffee / comfort break, and if everyone could come back at 2:30, we will have our next speaker, Alex Quinn. We'll then have breakout groups and then an opportunity for questions, which will be primarily taken by Oliver Lewis from Council at Doughty Street. And I see that I think we've had some contributions and questions in the chat that we will be looking at, and we'll be able to respond to some of them. So thank you very much for your engagement, and we will reconvene at 2:30. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, Alexis Quinn. Alexis is a school teacher of over 10 years, former professional athlete, and now author of 2 books. Her groundbreaking memoir, Unbroken, and Autistic and Expecting, a guide for autistic parents to be. Alexis now works as manager of the Restraint Reduction Network and is also studying an MSc in psychotherapy at University of Greenwich. So I'll now pass over to Alexis.
Oh, thank you, Angela, for your very kind introduction. So I guess I'm talking here today as an autistic person, as somebody that's been restrained in schools and also in mental health units. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah Leach, who's the director of the Restraint Reduction Network. So, could you change the slides? That'd be all right. That'd be really helpful. So the Restraint Reduction Network is a charity that focuses on restraint reduction, so reducing unnecessary restrictive practices. We work collaboratively with people with lived experience, families, academics, professionals, government organisations, all with a shared goal and a shared narrative to kind of reduce reliance on unnecessary restrictive practices. So we'll talk a little bit about those now. Next slide, please. So today we're going to think about what restraint is, and we've already had quite a breadth of different types of restrictive practice which we've been looking at. the types of safeguards that children don't have in schools, and as I said, eliminating the unnecessary use of those practices and really thinking about what needs to change. So what is restraint? Well, broadly speaking, next slide please, it's making someone do something that they don't want to do, or stopping someone doing something that they do want to do. The EHRC says that it's any action to limit a person's movement, liberty, or freedom to act independently. Next slide, please. So quite obviously, that's going to cover a real breadth of things that happen in our schools and in our systems and in our institutions. And using your body, okay, so physical restraint, is actually a very small part of that. Using equipment, again, a very small, significant part of that. Using the environment, so secluding people, a very small part of that. Certainly when I was in schools as a teacher, but also as a student receiving restrictive practices, I would say that blanket rules, okay, which is where one rule is applied to a group of people, irrespective of the person's risk, is massive. Something that I used to do all the time, you know, as a teacher. I put the spots out teaching PE and all the kids had to sit on them, you know, things like that, which can be very difficult for certain populations of students. Cultural norms is another one where we're expecting people, okay, so neurodivergent children, to act in neurotypical ways. So, and communication strategies. So using communication strategies to influence somebody psychologically, okay, so a type of psychological restraint, also known as informal coercion. So those three things are happening all the time in our school systems. Something we're seeing on the increase is the use of surveillance, whether that's human surveillance or technological surveillance, often used in a very punitive way to, I guess, punish children, you know, to criminalise them if they've damaged property or if they've hurt somebody. So that's something that we're seeing an increase of as well. So why does this happen? Well, certainly in my experience, this is the sort of thing that happens, and the previous speaker was talking about that, I think, a bit earlier. So something happens, a crisis or a trauma, or in fact, you know, that might be having to sit still for 50 minutes, which is a very long time for everybody, I think, to sit still, but notably so for people that find that more challenging. And that creates an autistic, you know, an autistic reaction. So that might be self-stimulatory behaviour, something like this. I certainly sort of rub my legs, or needing to get up and stand up and pace a bit. And that was what happening for me in school. So I couldn't sit down for very long. So I was constantly fidgeting, moving. And as you were saying, Becky, earlier, you know, this constitutes disruptive, okay, disruptive behaviour, children that can't sit in seats. And so that would create, you know, some sort of response. Because the cultural norm, if we think back to that previous slide, the cultural norm is that all children have to behave in exactly the same way. So what teachers are constantly doing, this isn't just about, you know, as Becky was saying about data, what teachers are constantly doing is that expectation, that normalizing, right, that normalizing expectation. And so really at that stage of the cycle where there is that autistic reaction, you start to feel othered, okay? So you're a naughty child, you're a fidgeter, you have attention deficit, you know, you need some medication because you know you're not conforming to those cultural norms. And so then something will happen. So often I would have to, you know, stand outside, you know, face the wall. If I was in the gym, I'd get moved away, even though I was the best player on all of the teams, by the way. I'd get moved away until they needed me, and then I was back in, right? And secluded in a room, you know, with a box around me, you know, and maybe given some lines about I must not fidget in the future, something like that. So all of these things increase unpredictability, they increase the sort of changeable environment, but what they also do is they other people, okay? And so what you start to do is internalize this narrative that you're bad, naughty, you know, you're misbehaving, and as the previous speaker said, it sets up this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so this creates a bigger, often autistic reaction when those restrictions are put in place, because not only have you got, you know, your everyday anxieties of having to conform to this this normalizing agenda, this kind of masking that you're having to do, but you also know there's now going to be a punishment, right, for that behavior. And so then greater restrictions happen. And what happens is that the person, the class, because remember, this is a cultural thing, it's an organismic thing. So the class also start to other you. The class and the teacher and the person get caught in this cycle. So what we need to be doing if we're thinking about distress reduction, we need to be thinking about distress reduction for restraint reduction or elimination, okay, to be happening. We need to be thinking about distress reduction. So how can we create in schools, break that kind of cycle? Next slide, please. So obviously, the biggest thing we need to do, which has already been alluded to by the brilliant speakers earlier, is support children's individual needs, because they're often sensory charged, they're often, very changeable environments with a high level of restriction in them already, which goes unchallenged. It goes unchallenged that children should have to sit down for 8 hours a day, and if they don't, what are we going to do to them to make them do that? And that's obviously where we get that kind of chemical restraint. How many, I was on Ritalin, I was very, very young, because I was moving too much. So there was that kind of chemical element there for me as well. And of course, we need to we might need to change staff, but we might need to train them first to understand, the different ways that children are communicating distress, and get them to rethink, right, about actually what schools are for, because, they're really to empower children to want to learn, to be curious, I should hope, and all of those things, and clearly. Any constraint on that, whether it be psychological or more obviously physical, is really important. So as we know at the moment, in England and Wales, schools have the power to use reasonable force. Change the slide, please, if you've got that. To use reasonable force for the reasons up there. And I think really important, to think about that third one there about, the maintenance of good order. Because again, what we're talking about is a cultural restraint, isn't it? If we think of restraint as stopping someone doing something they want to do, if a child needs to move, to understand, to listen, to hear, to internalize, to be educated, why are we stopping them from doing that? We've got to think culturally, I think, as well as those other really big things. And we've talked, we've heard a lot today about death, about bruising, about those physical injuries that happen. But certainly for me, I didn't die, but certainly for me, those bruises, they go, but the emotional harm, okay, the psychological harm that happens because of restrictive practices. There's a legacy of that, I can assure you, for a lifetime. I'm 38 now. There is a legacy of that for a lifetime. We've talked about physical death, but what about social death? What about social death? What about being locked in a room where you can neither be perceived, because nobody's there, because it's windowless, you can't be seen, and you can't perceive another, and you're expected to stay there for what, how long? Because there's this unwritten rule somewhere that everyone has to kind of behave the same. So for me, the seclusion and isolation of children, okay, away from others if they're disruptive is it's really disgusting, and it doesn't, of course there's the sort of the inhumaneness, the degrading element of it, but we must start to be thinking about that social element of it as well. Because you get to a stage where you've internalized so many sort of bad me narratives, so many, I'm an awful person, I deserve to be here, that you've got that, that drop in self-esteem, that lowering of confidence. And when you have those two things, you're constricting people's agency to express themselves in ways they find most comfortable. These things are really, really life limiting. It also means that you come to believe that when you interact with another, you expect a negative response from that person. And so it's not probably the case that autistic people don't like to be around people. It's more the case that autistic people are scared of other people and the reactions they might incur through those interactions. So we need to be thinking about that that slow social death, that's happening to children in our schools. So if you see an autistic person standing over there and the rest of the class over there, it's probably not to do with their diagnosis and their internal neurology. It's most likely to do with the fact they've been consistently bullied every time they try to interact with people. The other stuff's been covered, so I'm not going to dwell on it. So obviously, we need a greater proportion of, sorry, next slide. Thank you so much, you're on it. You're on it already, the one before. Thank you so, brilliant, brilliant. Obviously, we need a greater protection of safeguards for children. I was in mental health inpatient units for 4 years. If you want to know about that, you can read my book Unbroken. And in there, every time a restraint happened, it had to be written up. Mostly my parents were informed if it happened. Every time there was a chemical restraint, you know, it's monitored. Every time I was put into sort of long-term segregation, the CQC had to be informed about it. There's all of these kind of layers. Every time we're doing something to somebody, there's this scrutiny. This isn't in place in our schools. So why is it, you know, that when I'm sort of age 27 to 31 and I'm detained for 4 years, that there's more scrutiny than when I was in school, and all of that stuff, or most of it, a lot of it, certainly the written and the chemical part, you know, you've got the seclusion part, you've got the cultural part, you've got the blanket restrictions part, you know, all of those things are just unregulated. But in schools, blanket restrictions are massive. You know, the schools run on blanket restrictions. But the CQC will come into a unit, you know, they have a focus on it. They have a focus on blanket restrictions. How can we reduce those things? So it's a real disparity, isn't it? Which again has been spoken about earlier. So I won't dwell on that. So what are we going to do, I suppose? Well, the recommendation, you know, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which again, Becky mentioned earlier, was that there should be training standards. Clearly, there need to be national training standards focusing on minimising restraint by taking a human rights-based approach. And I would urge, you know, to be expanding how we think about that kind of death that happens, you know, to people, you know, that obviously the natural kind, but also that kind of social kind that happens through all of those things that I've just spoken about. So currently the restraint reduction training standards, which Sarah authored, which she'll speak to you about in a moment, you know, incorporate all of those different types of restrictive practices, because we must start to think more broadly about those. They've been accepted by the NHS, they're written into law, in Cheney's law, and really they must be, as this recommendation states, adapted for schools. So, you know, I put this up here because you guys can have a look at this on our website. But it's 6 core strategies. It's an evidence-based way to reduce all forms of restrictive practices. So if you'd like to have a look at that, if you're thinking about culture change for your schools, do take a look. Do take a look at that. The reason I've put it there as well, one of the second core strategy is about data. So if you could just move on to the data slide, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So why do we need to record restraint? Well, at the moment we don't really know what's happening, and what we've seen in mental health is that you know, with the going into law, Cheney's law, that, you know, there's an increased focus on it, and when we focus on something, you know, clearly things have to be written down. We know what we're focusing on, and what we're seeing is that teachers don't know what constitutes restrictive practice. They don't understand, you know, what blanket restrictions are. They don't understand what cultural restraint is, you know, all of those things, as well as the more obvious forms of, you know, physical restraint, seclusion, etc. So we need to start thinking about, you know, how, where, why, you know, this restraint is being used in a particular setting, which again is something that Sarah will talk about in terms of the training standards and how powerful those can be in making sure that people are trained in restraint that's proportionate to their setting. And only when we know these things really can we start to kind of minimize those. Next slide, please. So staff needs to understand what constitutes restraint. They need to know, you know, what it is that they need to record, and then analyse that to support pupils and staff in terms of debriefing. Could you put the debriefing thing on for people to watch, and then Sarah, you jump in, right? Gone on a bit, I'm afraid. Should we watch it or not?
Hi, my name is Oakley. I'm autistic, have a mild learning disability, and was abused when I was young. I sometimes get flashbacks, which you'll see in this animation. I'm going to talk about post-incident debriefing. So what is an incident? Well, an incident is a highly emotive interaction or event that might cause ongoing distress. This is sometimes caused by a miscommunication or a need not being met. This video will show you the pathway to an incident I had a few years ago. You might see lots of places where the right support could have stopped my distress from escalating.
Hey Oakley. What are you doing over there? Why don't you sit back down?
Ow, get off, that hurts!
But I've hardly touched you. Where are you going? Come back.
Hey Oakley, is everything all right? Oh, I can see you're not all right. Wait there, and I'll be back in 1 minute.
Ow, get off!
Oh,
You'll be all right.
I'm here for you, Oakley. I want to listen and check you're okay. Give post-incident support immediately after the distressing occurrence. Over the next couple of days, reassure the person. Find out how you can help them feel safe.
the right member of staff needs to help. Ask yourself, do I know enough to help this person? Am I in a place to put the child first? Would a colleague be better at providing support than me?
It's important staff acknowledge my emotions and help me feel safe and supported.
Sometimes it's hard to know what to say. Listen and validate. I usually say, I can see why that was so distressing for you. I'm still here for you. It's important to me that you feel okay. What can I do now to help?
Don't probe. Don't interrogate. Don't fact-find. Don't educate. You are providing safety in support, not judgment, not an education.
It probably hasn't escaped you that there are a few places where knowledge of Oakley's triggers, communication preferences and sensory experiences might have helped avert this distress. This is why post-incident learning is important.
No one wants to feel blamed or worse about what happened or didn't happen.
Post-incident learning must be carried out by a skilled facilitator, after a period of cool down, in a non-accusatory way. It's a space for reflections and thinking about ways to prevent distress.
One last thing. The staff helping always did their best with the resources they had. Quick check-ins when you have the time make all the difference. Thank you for all you do to help.
So that video was obviously about the post-incident debriefing part, which is another one of the 6 core strategies. But how would we know to do that if we don't know what constitutes an incident, if we don't know what constitutes a restraint? So you can see that kind of education for teachers and changing the culture and changing the way that we think about things and understanding, you know, incidents of distress as communication. You could really see that those things building up there in the video. It was really important. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, that's great. And so I'll just invite Sarah up now, who's the director, and she can introduce herself, which is the director of the Restraint Reduction Network and also authored the training standards.
Thank you. Can I go back one? Thank you. So it's hard to follow Alexis. we had really good feedback on that debriefing film, and showed it to lots of people in Spain, working in Spain last week, and they loved it as well. Immediately translated it into Spanish. They thought it was really useful. So Lex has just asked me to just going to talk 2 or 3 slides about the training standards, which she's mentioned. There were restraint reduction training standards, network training standards, published in 2019, and I'll tell you why we did that. There is a certification scheme, so people that have training in a restrictive practice can be certified against the restraint reduction network training standards, and that certification scheme is accredited by UCAS. So it's a national scheme for. Now, if you think about restraint and all kinds of restrictive practices, probably the most dangerous things that you can teach anyone to do. So the fact that there's unregulated training is, I still find quite shocking. So at the moment in health and social care, you have to have training. If you're going to be taught to use restraint, if you're going to be taught to take people to the ground and restrain them, you have to have training that is certified. You have to have proper quality assured training. In schools, you don't. Okay, so we know, and we've heard about schools that are. Do you want me to use them? No. Okay. So we've heard about schools that are using security guards to give them training, that are using people from the karate club. You know, basically, and people don't know. People don't know what they don't know, do they? So they'll just look on a website. Okay, that looks like someone who can come around and teach the teachers how to restrain. And you just think about the dangerousness of that. Okay, so pretty much when we started thinking about, pretty much when we started thinking about why do we need these training standards? Well, because there was a lot of concern. Some training is okay, but there was a whole range of no quality assurance. So in 2019. We started to think actually what we need is some mandatory training standards. There was a voluntary code of practice before, and you'll know the thing about a voluntary code of practice is that probably the good, the better ones will join that, but the people who aren't so good will not need to bother. So we think we need something that is mandatory. So there was a complete lack of quality assurance of training. Nowhere in that training there's anyone with lived experience involved. You know, so you're talking about training people to do something and they don't know what it's like to have it done to them. Okay, they haven't heard that. Okay, so that was a real problem. Very much a focus on reactive techniques. So people were being taught how to restrain and how to restrain very well sometimes, but not how to restrain. Okay, so we needed to change that dynamic as well. So very much on this focus on technical competence, using restraint as a kind of physical way of managing people, and a lot of it is called behaviour management training. Control and restraint, you've probably heard of that kind of stuff. So there's a huge, it's this kind of stuff that keeps you awake at night, really. Not enough focus in most of that training on any human rights, de-escalation, prevention. People are just buying training how can we be technically competent to restrain adults and children? And you think about the additional dangers that are involved in restraining children by adults, it's very, very, very exposed. Okay, what's up the next? Okay, so over here, mate. Sorry, I'm just stood here. So you must. So if you've had training that's been certificated now by the standards, what that means is that you will have been trained in human rights, you will have been trained in some kind of prevention skill, and you will have heard from people with lived experience before you are even allowed to understand how to do physical skills or any restrictive practice. Okay, so you have to do all of that before. So I think in the standards at the moment, you have to do 2 days of that before you could even come to that, before you could even be taught. Okay, so the other thing that was really, really important, and probably we had most pushback on, was the fact that the training that people receive now has to be proportionate and appropriate to the population and the setting. Okay, so that's really important. So you can imagine children have completely different needs, safety needs as to adults. So the other thing that was also happening is that people were being taught lots and lots and lots of different restraint techniques that they were never going to use and they didn't need. And all the research shows that if you teach people to use something, that's the tool in the box they would go to, because you weren't teaching them prevention skills either. So quite often, and people would start work, they might be working in Tesco's on Friday, they start work at a school or a residential care home Monday, they'd be taught restraint techniques. So that organisation is really kind of reinforcing that. So if people are taught to do that, that's what they will do. You know, they're not doing it because they're bad people. That's what they've been taught to do. That's what they've been taught to do when people are distressed. Not being taught how to de-escalate, how to prevent the distress from happening in the first place. So, next one. Okay, so just to reiterate that again, so it's mandatory to have that certified training in adult health and social care, okay, but not in schools, okay? It's been recommended now in the new Scottish Government guidance and the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, which you've heard about. So there's an opportunity for us now to make sure that's in the new DFE guidance, you know. Otherwise, we're really behind, you know, really, really exposed in England. I think that's probably all I want.
Membership slide.
Oh yeah, the last slide is please join the Restraint Reduction Network. It's completely free, but we'd like you to do
And
that.
also there's so many resources on there which we've not managed to kind of touch on today, especially stuff about, you know, debriefing and 6 core strategies and really practical things that people in schools can use to reduce restrictive practices. And thank you for having us today.
No, thank you both very much. As you say, the discrepancy between regulation for adults in comparison to children is quite shocking,
Yeah,
really.
really shocking.
Yes.
Children have no safeguard.
So thank you. We're now at 3 o'clock and we're going to split into breakout groups. To guide discussion, it's entirely up to you. There will be a list of potential themes or questions which focus on some of the questions in the consultation. It's entirely up to you if you want to discuss those or if you want to discuss other issues in your breakout groups. I would ask if you could appoint one spokesperson to just give a summary at 3:40 when we reconvene of the key points and issues that were raised in your discussion. Other than that, it's your free time and opportunity to talk to one another in your groups about these really pressing fundamental issues of human rights and rights of children that we've been covering in the last couple of hours. So I will leave it to Narissa to sort out the technicalities, which I'm sure will work very smoothly, and we'll reconvene at 3:40 where there'll be an opportunity, if there are any burning questions, to put those to Oliver.
Would you like us to give you some feedback, Oliver?
That would be amazing. Thank you very much.
Okay, how many groups are there, just out of interest? Because it was
3 remote groups, and there's one, I think there was 1 group in Chambers. So
okay,
just the headlines.
Headlines. We were essentially talking about the backdrop to the context in which restraint happens, and the question of whether, and the fact that we know that in many cases they haven't. Mainstream teachers, TAs, many staff in mainstream children's services have had very little, if any, training in neurodiversity, and that significantly affects the way they may see and therefore treat neurodiverse, autistic, learning disabled children, and that many of the children that we work for have a complex number of diagnoses that we need to understand. If you haven't had some of that training, both in terms of the child rights, the human rights that Alexis explained so beautifully, thought that was a wonderful presentation, but the human rights and child rights stuff, but also the child protection side of these issues. And secondly, but perhaps more important, certainly equally important, is direct training from neurodiverse people who can help people that have not thought about it to see the world differently. And it's that one-size-fits-all assumption that creates real difficulties, because when neurodiverse children need different things, they have a right to be understood, and we haven't got that training right. The second thing we talked about was that many neurodiverse kids are actually in special educational needs sections of mainstream schools. So this is really critical. Thirdly, we talked about the importance of every bit of training around these children's needs being underpinned by trauma-informed practice. And I'm sure Heidi's going to say a bit more about that in a minute, but That is so important. It is so critical because these children have almost absorbed a snowballing effects of trauma throughout the course of their lives by the misunderstanding and mistreatment that they face. We talked about the need for there to be up-to-date safeguarding disabled children guidance. I co-chair the National Working Group on Safeguarding Disabled Children, and I work for the Ancraft Trust, and we are deeply concerned that this essential practice guidance is very out of date. The needs of these children is very briefly referred to in the Working Together Safeguarding Guidance, but without any information, support or help about what that looks like in practice in multidisciplinary settings. So out-of-date guidance doesn't help, working together doesn't help, but both should be sorted out and updated. And thirdly, we started to ask the question, which I think Heidi and I think is really important, which is about why are we not using the Equality Act for the protected characteristics of these children? Why are they problematized instead of us problematizing our treatment of them? And Heidi is promised me faithfully she'd come in. So I'm going to pass the baton to Heidi quickly because I'm sure I'll have missed stuff.
I think you did brilliantly. You did brilliantly. You've just covered it all. We talked about how, just to add to that, we talked about how families in particular look to guidance rather than law, and that you'll get families coming to meetings when their children have been restrained and they'll know their way around, for example, DFE guidance, where they might not know their way around the law underpinning that guidance. And we talked about how, as a comparison, the recent new guidance that we've had from DFE around, for example, absence codes for children who are unable to attend because of illness has been really helpful to families. And so whilst we're waiting for legislative change, which we do think is important, we think there's something about empowering and upskilling people, supporting children who might be more vulnerable to restraint around existing guidance and law. So the Equality Act, and perhaps stuff around definitions of reasonable, definitions of last resort, and helping families, we were talking about specifically, understand their rights within that framework. It was a great conversation.
I think one last point is, and I encounter this around the country delivering training in Wales and England, that not everybody has heard of, still less read, the restrictive interventions guidance that we do have. We know that we're still waiting for a timetable for the government to bring in some mandatory reporting and other points that they have promised to do following the Equality and Human Rights Council's report. So I think we've got a really long way to go, both strategically and at frontline practice and management support levels.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Heidi, on behalf of your group. Really interesting points. As a lawyer, I'd say that unfortunately, neither the guidance nor the law is very helpful to children and their families right now. So
absolutely
both of them need to be updated. I'll be saying a few words about the consultation in a couple of minutes. And the other thing that from my group online, one of the remote groups, was we were discussing how for many teachers and people out there in society, disabled children, in particular neurodiverse kids, are assumed to be sort of uncontrollable, uncontrolled, certainly unpredictable, and probably violent. And that's the assumption. And that it's just natural that you should use restraints because the violence is, going to be part and parcel of these young kids' lives. That's the assumption. And then the law and policy has the teachers back. So it comes from a place of defending any action that the teacher or the staff deem to be reasonable in the circumstances, rather than being child focused and recognizing that perhaps if you're violent towards a child, perhaps that's an indication of an unmet need. Good. Thank you very much. There must be one more online group that, apart from the one that I was in and the one that Heidi and Sarah were in, one more remote group would like to feedback. I'm hearing nothing, therefore I'll turn to the Doughty Street in-person group. I don't know who, Angela, wants to say a few words to feedback on behalf of the group there.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, we spoke about many of the same themes, really. And I think it's really this sort of cultural point and the structures that are in place. So we spoke about how there seems to be this culture of policing in schools. and teachers almost acting like police, and these sort of gross restrictions on agency that there are in schools, and we need to sort of challenge that. And that really comes down to sort of educating teachers on that policing mentality. We also spoke about, you know, what you were just saying really about that concept that violent behavior really happens because, you know, people are inherently bad or want it to happen, and this normalizing agenda for marginalized groups and, you know, this one size fits all approach in schools. We also touched upon briefly the fact that actually the Ofsted inspection system doesn't really adequately allow for difference and sort of promotes that conformity in schools. And also really, yeah, the fact that schools seem to have not moved on, and it is quite an archaic culture. So it's this cultural restraint that Alexis spoke about. We also spoke about the importance of relationships for you know, these children and them feeling safe. And actually, we've heard from parental experience that actually they've never had to restrain their children. So why is this having to happen in school? And also, you know, we know about the lack of provision being a serious issue, and actually sometimes SEMH is used, and schools are being forced to sort of accept autistic pupils when they're not adequately sort of resourced and able to meet those needs. Again, spoke about trauma-informed approaches and the importance of that, and actually, you know, adopting trauma-informed approaches across the board won't harm pupils who've not experienced trauma. So actually, you know, that should be the starting point. Prevention training, again, like Alexis spoke about, teachers needing to be given these tools instead of actually the focus, the starting point being on discipline, because, you know, they will use the tools that they're given. Spoke around the language of violence and aggression, and sort of this superhumanization of these children being seen sort of out of control. And also the importance of deconstructing these incidents and actually describing what happened without using those words like violence, and the importance of having representation of neurodivergent individuals in schools, but also, you know, they're not adequately represented always in academic circles, and so, you know, that representation is key. And then we also sort of finally spoke about staff recruitment and actually it being important for schools to focus on values-based recruitment as well, so ensuring that staff have, you know, empathy and compassion and understanding in that way, as opposed to it, you know, just focusing on their skills. So hopefully I've sort of covered the main points. Does anyone want to add anything? And it can't be done in a cost neutral way. You know, this is something that needs to be invested in, and there needs to be an appreciation of that.
Thank you very much. Could you just give us your name? You're so small on my screen.
It's me. It's Beth Parr from Erwin Mitchell.
Oh, hi, Beth. Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks so much for summarizing the in-person group. So it falls upon me just to say a few words in closing, if that's okay. I've put into the chat 2 hyperlinks to 2 slightly different parts of the government's consultation. So as everyone knows, hopefully, the government has a couple of weeks, well, a month ago, issued a call for evidence on the use of reasonable force and restrictive practices in schools. And there's a survey that you can click through. So please do that, and please cascade this to anyone who you know, because it's so important that the government gets feedback from parents, from young people themselves, from teachers, from anyone with any expertise and interest in this subject. I like some of the questions, especially the ones with a sort of open box where you can just type anything you like. I think that some of the questions are slightly problematic in the sense that they seem to give options to things that don't seem very reasonable, such as reporting incidents only, reporting only those incidents which in which a child is injured, for example. which I think, as Alexis and others have said, would continue the system whereby children in schools fare worse than, for example, adults in mental health units, which just can't be right. So please fill the survey in. There's additional questions for school staff, and then 2 additional questions for parents, both of which are quite restrictive themselves and are about parents' experiences in how they think the child's school communicates their school policies with the parents, and assessing the parents' confidence in their child's school's behaviour policy and use of reasonable force, which I think is 2 slightly strange questions. And I also don't particularly appreciate the use of the term reasonable force, which runs throughout all of this. And the rhetoric, of course, is that any force is by definition reasonable because a teacher or someone professional or a teaching assistant carried out that force. And so I would encourage you, if you want to say something about that, to do so in the consultation, which runs until the 11th of May this year. Another point that we wanted just to raise is the importance of coalition building. And what we've tried to do in designing today's seminar is to have a variety of speakers who are all been fantastic. Thank you so much to Becky and Gareth and Alexis who have spoken, and others have been so informative, but who are all of the speakers today came from a sort of disability rights or human rights perspective. And I think if push came to shove, perhaps everyone in the room would agree with the notion that restrictive practices in schools need to be abolished, if not radically reduced down to absolute necessity. And the example given by Becky was, yes, it's obviously okay to restrain a child who wants to run out of the school and run into the street. But apart from those sorts of scenarios, any care planned intervention where a child is going to be restrained or put into a seclusion room, whatever that seclusion room is called, should be banned in law. However, not everyone who responds to the consultation is going to say that. So we think it's really important to build coalitions with teachers who are obviously not the enemy. They're at the front line, and in the same way as nurses and doctors and people in other public sectors have faced over a decade of reduction of resources, teachers are also doing their best, mostly with very, very few resources. So something that can create a common ground between the disability rights movement and the teaching unions and teachers themselves and head teachers is the call for more resources to be put into the educational sector. So if people have ideas about how to reach out to teachers, how to reach out to teaching unions in particular, who are very strong, obviously, so that they are also calling for a radical reduction, if not an abolition of restrictive practices, then please let us know. Can I finally, on my own behalf and on behalf of Chambers, thank my colleagues Rai and Larissa very much, and the reception staff, all of whom putting events like this on always requires much more work than is actually visible. So thank you to them very much. Can I also thank Angela and Beth and Ryan from Owen Mitchell for co-organising and co-running this seminar. And again, apologies due to family circumstances, I was not able to be in London with you today. But that's all I wanted to say. Angela, if I can hand over to you maybe to wrap up.
Equally a very large thank you, Oliver, who came up with the idea of the seminar today. It's been a really invaluable experience hearing from our excellent speakers, it sounds, well, I'm confident that the breakout discussions were also equally valuable, sharing ideas, thinking about the way forward, thinking about strategies, and as Oliver has said, thinking about coalition building, because we can't do this just as one sector of the big picture, and trying to reach out to teachers as well and engaging them and really trying to battle for extra resources is crucial. And so often all of these battles in terms of social welfare and education law relates sadly to resources, especially in the current climate. But I feel very invigorated from today. I think that if we all really focus on making sure that we respond to the consultation and also point out its limitations, you know, we know that it's limited, and I think this is also an opportunity to try to get the government to speak, to think bigger and outside the box and really look at the whole issues holistically so that we have a really effective way forward. So thank you everyone for attending today. There are some people who registered and hopefully will watch the recording and feel equally enthused. But a big thanks everybody, and let's keep on battling for our young people in the education system. Thank you everybody.